Hi, everyone. Welcome to Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller. I've spent over 30 years in healthcare sales, from building lasting partnerships to driving real results for hospitals and health systems. I'm here to share what I've learned about leading with service and how that can change the game for you no matter where you are in your career. So today I want to talk about something that I think is, probably the most fundamental issue I see when companies try to sell into hospitals. It's this gap, right, between the companies that sell into healthcare and the companies that are actually, trusted by healthcare. And that gap has a name. I call it fluency. And, most companies selling into hospitals just don't have it. So let me paint a picture for you because I think this really brings it to life. There's a meeting happening right now, like right now in a hospital somewhere in this country. You've got a CFO, a CMO, a VP of supply chain. They're all sitting around a conference table and they're not talking about your product, right? They're talking about a CMS penalty notice that, showed up last Thursday. They're talking about what happens to their operating margin if their readmission rate doesn't move by Q3. They're talking about the team model going mandatory next year and what that means for their orthopedic service line. And, your competitor's rep is in that meeting, not because their product is better than yours, not because they outpriced you or, outmaneuvered you or got there first. They're in that meeting because 6 months ago when the CFO mentioned HRP, your rep nodded politely and pivoted back to the product demo. Their rep stopped and asked a very specific question about which DRGs were driving the penalty and then, spent the next 20 minutes talking like somebody who'd actually been on the other side of that table, not like a vendor. And that's it. That's the only difference. So I'm not going to talk today about sales tactics or closing techniques or, account mapping or how to get past the gatekeeper, right? There's enough out there on all of that. And I think this is about something more fundamental than all of that. It's like there's a real gap between, being heard and actually being taken seriously. And there's a gap between having a great product and actually winning the deal, right? I spent 30 years on the inside of healthcare, managing budgets, evaluating vendors, sitting in the meetings where the real decisions get made. And I've seen really extraordinary products lose to mediocre ones because the seller couldn't speak the language of the executive in the room. I've watched sales teams spend, 12 months in a sales cycle that should have taken 4 because nobody on the team could connect their solution to the right pressure point at the right level of the organization. And here's the thing, this is a solvable problem, not through a one-day training, not through a glossary of healthcare acronyms, stapled to the back of your sales playbook, but through a genuine structural change in how your team understands the market it's operating in. So let me be really clear about what fluency actually means here, because I think people hear that word and they think, oh, okay, so I got to memorize some acronyms, right? Like I got to put my team through a compliance training module or add a regulatory insight slide to my pitch deck. That's not it. That's not fluency. Fluency is understanding how hospitals actually work, how they make money, how they lose it, who they answer to, and, what keeps their executives up at 3 a.m. And when you understand that, something really remarkable happens, right? Like the whole conversations changes, the room changes. You're no longer a vendor presenting features. You're a peer presenting solutions to problems the executive already knows they have. And I think that's the moment deals actually get made. So here's something that the hospital's never going to tell you, right? So when your rep walks in for that first meeting, the executive on the other side of the table, like they're not thinking about your product, they're thinking about a number. Sometimes it's a readmission rate, sometimes it's an operating margin that's been shrinking for like 18 months, or sometimes it's a CMS penalty they already know is coming in, they haven't even told their board about yet. Whatever that number is, it sits behind every question they ask, every objection they raise, and every reason they give for why the timing isn't right. So your rep is selling a product and the executive is managing a crisis. And those two conversations almost never meet. And, that's the entire problem. I want to talk about something that I think is really, really important for understanding why this happens. And it's that the hospital your rep visits it's not the hospital that makes decisions. You walk into almost any major health system in this country and you'll find, essentially two hospitals occupying the same building. The first hospital is the one your sales team can see, right? It's got departments and service lines and administrators with titles and org charts and procurement portals. It's got a clinical champion who loves your product and a supply chain director who wants 3 competing bids. Budget cycle starts in September. Committee meets on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. And this is the hospital most sales teams are trained to navigate. And this is also, the hospital where deals go to stall. But the second hospital is the one that actually makes the decisions, right? And it runs on federal reimbursement rules, quality metrics, penalty calculations, the terms of their debt, and its real leadership team. It's CMS, it's their accreditation body, their bondholders, their state health department. Like, none of these people show up on any org chart your sales team has ever seen. And I think every major purchasing decision in that hospital, before anything else, it gets filtered through one question. Does this move our numbers in a direction that keeps us viable? And I think this is so important to understand. These executives aren't being difficult when they slow walk your deal. They're being rational. They're managing an organization that answers to more bosses than, probably any other type of organization out there. And they're operating on margins that would shut down most businesses in other industries. And then on top of that, the regulatory frameworks are changing every year and carry like 8-figure financial consequences when you get them wrong. And I think until your team really understands how that hospital actually works, the real version of it, you're just not going to be in the conversations. So let me show you what I mean with real scenario here. So let's say it's early October, right? And a CFO at a regional health system, she opens her email and she finds the annual hospital readmissions reduction program update from CMS, telling her that her system's readmission rate for heart failure patients puts them in the penalty tier for the coming fiscal year. The penalty is $2.3 million, not catastrophic, but, really serious, especially for a system that's already running a 1.8% operating margin, right? Like the $2.3 million penalty doesn't just affect the budget, it affects what gets delayed, what gets cut, and who has to go explain it to the board. She's got 6 weeks until her board meeting to have a plan. And she's not reaching for your sales deck, right? She calls her VP of quality, she calls her CMO, she pulls the data on which service lines are driving the readmissions and which patient populations are most at risk. She starts asking, what are other health systems in our peer group doing about this? And has any vendor actually moved the needle on this metric in a way that's, documented and that we can actually replicate? Now, if your rep reaches out to this CFO in the next 2 weeks and, it's clear from the message that they actually understand how HRP penalties are calculated, right? And they can talk about the specific DRGs that are probably driving her readmission rate, and they've got, real outcomes from health systems that look like hers. That rep gets a meeting. Not because they got lucky, right? Because they were fluent. But if they send some generic outreach about, improving patient outcomes through innovative care coordination technology, that email is getting deleted before she even finishes her coffee. And it's the same products, same company, completely different result. And the only difference is whether that seller could actually talk about the problem that executive was dealing with that morning. And look, that HRP story is not an edge case, right? That is the operating reality for every hospital in the country right now, multiplied across 6 major CMS programs running simultaneously. So you've got HRP, the Hospital Readmissions Reduction Program, right? And that's penalizing hospitals for, excess readmissions on specific conditions. And we're talking more than $550 million a year in penalties. I mean, that is a really, really significant number. You've got the Hospital Value-Based Purchasing Program that puts 2% of every hospital's Medicare reimbursement at risk based on quality and patient experience scores, right? Then there's the team model, right? The transforming episode accountability model, and that's making bundle payments mandatory for surgical episodes at hundreds of hospitals. And I think people really underestimate how much that changes, how those hospitals think about everything around a procedure, like every device, every piece of technology that's involved. Then you've got the Access program, and that's basically building out a 10-year chronic care infrastructure that covers, about 2/3 of Medicare beneficiaries, which huge. You've got the Rural Health Transformation Program, which is a $50 billion federal investment that's reshaping how smaller hospitals operate and what they can even afford to buy. And then there's the IOTA kidney transplant model, right? And that one's, giving transplant centers up to $15,000 per case if they hit their performance targets. So that's a real incentive. And here's the thing. Every single one of these programs is a commercial opportunity for the right company with the right message. If your sales team hasn't put in the work to understand, what these programs actually mean for a health system, then all of this is just invisible to them. Like they don't even know it's there. So when you're fluent in this stuff, then you read a CMS program, update the way a financial analyst reads an earnings report. You're not just looking at what it says, right? You're looking at which person inside the hospital now has a new problem to solve, a new budget to justify, or a new metric to move. And that's where the conversation starts. That's where the deal begins. So here's the part that, surprises most sales leaders when I tell them, by the time a hospital executive agrees to even evaluate a vendor solution, the real decision has already been made, right? Like what kind of problem needs solving, what kind of investment makes sense. They've already figured that out. That decision happened in a leadership meeting your rep wasn't in. It happened in response to a regulatory update your rep didn't read. It happened because a penalty hit, a quality score dropped, or a new CMS mandate landed that changed the math on something the executive had been deferring for 2 years. And the companies that are fluent in healthcare, they're in the room before the formal evaluation even starts, right? Like they're the ones being cited in the leadership conversations. Their frameworks are on the whiteboard. Their language is showing up in the memo the CMO sends to the CFO. And it wasn't, better prospecting or more aggressive follow-up that got them there. It was because when you looked at what they were doing, the content, the conversations, you could just tell these people actually get how hospitals work. And the vendor evaluation that follows, that's not where they win the deal. That's where they confirm what the executive already decided. So I want to make sure this really lands because I think that the cost of this fluency gap is something people underestimate a lot. This gap between where most healthcare sales teams operate and where they need to operate, it's not a skills gap. It's not a product gap. It's not a pricing gap. It's a fluency gap, and it compounds every single quarter. Every meeting where your rep can't speak to the regulatory context costs you positioning. Every proposal that leads with features instead of financial outcomes costs you credibility. Every sales cycle that stretches to 14 months because nobody on your team could connect your solution to the right pressure point. That's the fluency gap expressing itself as lost revenue. And, this is not just a sales team issue, right? I think that's the thing people miss. It's a company design issue. And understanding that distinction is what separates the organizations that actually fix it from the ones that keep scheduling, remedial training and wondering why nothing changes. But the good news is this is solvable through a genuine structural change in how your team understands the market it's operating in. And the companies that figure this out first, they're going to win way more than their fair share of every market they compete in. And the ones that don't are going to keep sending proposals into procurement portals and wondering why nothing's moving. So here's what I want you to do. And I think this is, really important. So go pull the CMS HRP penalty data for, your top 5 target accounts. And by the way, this is publicly available, right? Look at, what penalty tier they landed in for the current fiscal year, figure out which conditions are driving their readmission rates, and then write like a 2-paragraph note that connects your solution to that specific pressure. And here's the key, right? Write it in the CFO's language, not yours. And don't send it yet, right? Just write it. If you can't write it, then you've found the gap, and that's where the work starts. So if this is resonating with you, if you're sitting there thinking, we've got this fluency gap, this is exactly the kind of work I do through Fluent Healthcare. There's a link in the show notes where you can learn more about bringing this to your company. And, I've also got some free resources there, some frameworks and things that I think will really help you get started on this. So make sure you check those out. That's it for this episode of Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller, and this is part 1 of a series on fluency, so there's a lot more coming. Until next time.